Span. All right, so Michael,
here,
Evan,
here,
Chase,
here,
Brandon,
here,
Don,
here,
Michael,
here,
Cody,
here,
David,
here,
Aaron,
here,
Danny,
here.
Adrian, Josh. Okay. Okay. So, just talking about, oh, I need to update that. This should be over here, should be here. Okay. Okay, so talking about today, what we want to talk about is some more stuff kind of related to REST APIs and Mongo, and getting into some of the things that kind of fit together there for 4.3 for your lab there. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today. And then tomorrow, just a note, I am out. Mr. G will be here covering for lab day. And on Monday, the plan is to continue with 4.3. That's when it's due, is on Monday. On Tuesday next week, we'll start talking more about searching. I'll talk about searching and aggregate pipelines and how to put that together, which will be 4.4. Is how do you build search interfaces. Okay, so today we want to kind of talk about child entities and related entities and how that all fits together. So I'm going to start with doing a few things on the whiteboard up here and just talking about the theoretical aspects of this. So, okay. So we think about working with Mongo. Remember that there are different ways to model relational data, right? This is kind of what we're talking about today, is how do we deal with relational data. So far you've kind of worked with two entities primarily, namely bugs and users, right? And they were kind of loosely coupled, right? Only coupled in the way that like a user was maybe assigned to a bug, but we weren't really tracking a lot of that coupling, a lot of those relationships, as we may say, right? But that's a really important part as we proceed further. And so one of the things I'm going to ask you in 4.3, and you've seen this already if you looked and started at the lab, is to attach some related data to the bugs, right? So namely, we have users and we have bugs. And so what we're going to start attaching to that is comments and test cases. Both of which will be in turn related back to users, right? So you've got who wrote the comment, you've got who created the test case, and you've also got who executed the test case. Okay. So this is linked back to two users, this is linked back to one user. Okay, so we're going to talk about how do we deal with that data. So one of the things that we're seeing here is that a comment is only ever related to one bug, and a test case is only ever related to one bug, right? So we've got a one-to-many relationship. And so that could mean that we could kind of say almost as if like the comment is part of the bug, or the test case is part of the bug, right? And so that's kind of the cases that we're talking about. Make sense? Okay. So there are two different ways, remember, to model these sort of relationships with Mongo. There's not just one, right? So the traditional relational database model of this would be say, okay, we've got 4 different tables here. That's traditionally what we said. We just said, here's a table, here's a table, here's a table, here's a table. Done. Make sense? Easy fix. Okay. Now, remember, I can do that same thing with Mongo. I can say these are 4 collections. I can solve it that way. I can solve it by saying these are 4 different collections. But maybe I don't want to do it that way. Maybe I want to take one of the other routes, okay? And so remember that one of the things that we can do with Mongo is that we can also nest data. We can nest documents within other documents, right? So I can either split them up as 2 separate collections, or I can nest them inside of the same collection. Make sense? So this could actually be, it could be 4 collections, or it could just be 2 collections, right? Maybe all the comments and test cases belong in the bugs. Okay? So that's what we want to talk about, right? How do we deal with that, and what kind of implications does that have as we're working through that? Make sense? With that child data. So we kind of, I would call this like a child collection, because it depends on bugs, right? You can't have a comment without a bug. You can't have a test case without a bug. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going. Before we get there, I want to talk about kind of what the example that we're working with. Remember, we're working with this pet adoption, right? So one way I might think about that, as far as other things we can add, is maybe the pets have toys, and maybe they have appointments. I'm going to add some more collections effectively, some more data to that scheme, right? So that's kind of where we're thinking. So to figure out what we should do here, remember that there's an overarching rule that they talked about when you looked at the anti-pattern videos for Mongo. Remember, there's a rule that they kept repeating. And that rule is, with Mongo, data that is accessed together should be stored together. Should be stored together. That's our driving rule, right? That's our driving rule with it, is we say the data that is accessed together should be stored together. If it's not accessed together, you should store it separately, okay? That's a definite for sure. Cool? Okay. So other things to remember from the anti-pattern series, this is kind of walking back. Remember that some of those anti-patterns were having, we wanted to avoid things like unbounded arrays. We don't want to have an array inside of our documents that grows infinitely, that just keeps growing. They should be limited and have a kind of a small size, right? Good rule of thumb, if you're looking at an array that's about 5 or less elements, it's not going to get bigger than that. you're probably fine just putting it in the document itself, as long as it's accessed together. Everybody tracking with me there? As long as it's accessed together, then yeah, you can put it in there. Another thing to remember is that, you know, data that is related, doesn't mean that it should be stored together. Just because it's related doesn't mean that it should be stored together. So those are some of our driving decisions. Okay? Everybody with me there? So just because it's connected doesn't mean that you necessarily want to store it together. So in this case, you know, pets and toys and appointments are related, right? There's a connection between the two. But we don't know just from looking at that whether or not they're going to be accessed together. Does that make sense? In fact, you know, it's something that should inform your ERD, but isn't necessarily contained in that sort of, in the ERD itself, right? The knowledge to know whether or not it should be one collection or two. Okay? So where do we get that information? How do we know that data is accessed together or separately?
I guess you kind of have to think about your application and how it's going to be used.
Yes, right. So we have to think about the application. And specifically, we have to think about the front end of the application, typically. You have to say, well, in my head, this is how the UI is going to look, so this is how I'm going to do it. Make sense? So you have to kind of start picturing that endpoint of what the UI is going to look like, and then walk that back to the back end of how you're going to store the data. Okay? So let's think about this. So everybody have this written down so I can erase it and get back my space. Okay. So remember, that's our driving mode. Let's say I take this. I want to make a website out of it. Okay? So sensible pages to make might be, hey, let's have a page that shows a list of pets, right? And maybe it's got a little search box at the top. So up here, we've got a box. We've got a little search button here. Maybe we'll give it an icon. And then here, I have some cute pets. Okay, and the blocks. Well, what kind of information do we want to put in these parts?
Because we probably want the name and species of the dog, of the pet.
Okay, I'm going to write that down. So name, species, okay.
Probably gender too.
Probably gender. Okay. Anything else we want to show? Yeah, so we have the age, right? Is that going to look, if I just show this, is this going to look very user-friendly? Do you think anybody going to want to adopt the pets just from this information alone?
There might be one person.
So what you're saying, picture? How important is that picture? What's the first thing that they're going to see and look at? Probably the picture. So we should devote most of our screen real estate to pictures. Given that information, we should devote most of our screen real estate to pictures. In fact, we could go so far as say this entire card, just take it all with pictures, and we'll either have it like flip over, and that's the way you see this other information, or we'll kind of overlay it down at the bottom. Right? Let's take the approach that we'll say overlay it. Right. So in the middle here, we've got, you know, our little picture. I'm going to keep this simple. Picture. Picture. face with the neck. I don't know if that's good enough. There we go. Better? Okay, so then I kind of say, hey, well, what information do I want to put here? So I might say, okay, so I want to put their name. Maybe the name is in here somewhere. Name and species. And running out of space. So maybe I do it differently. So maybe I have Watson, cat, and male, and let's say he's 3 years old. Right? So I can fit that information in there. Okay? And so if I look at this screen, right, if I want to generate that screen, that's all the information I need. Right? If I'm going to design the screen that way, I need a picture, I need the name, the species, the gender, and the age, and that's it. Okay? So if I'm going to do it that way, I'm not showing toys or appointments on this screen. Does that make sense? So that's all the data I'm accessing together, at least as far as that screen is concerned. Everybody tracking with me so far? So that's all the data, at least from that screen's perspective, that I need to have in one place. What's the next screen that the user is going to see?
We'll probably click on one, it'll bring up more information.
Okay.
Possibility to change some things, add some stuff.
So we go over here, and the cat picture's still there. We have maybe his name and such off to the side. Do we want to add some more information onto here?
Yeah, so likes, dislikes, like toys.
Okay.
What do you mean by toys?
So maybe like a bio?
Maybe? Okay. So let's make some room here, maybe for a big bio. And you said likes, dislikes, and somewhere in here maybe we want to list their toys. Right? So you start thinking about what the screen's going to look like and what data do I need to populate that screen. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the view that we're talking about. You know, when we're talking about accessing it together, we're talking about generally, you know, what data do I need in the package to display a screen or do whatever other operation I need to do. It could be things that don't necessarily have a screen, don't necessarily have a UI, but oftentimes it will be ending up on a UI. Okay? So if I say this perspective, right, so from this perspective, I need a limited amount of information on the first screen because there's only so much I could display, right? Versus when I go down to this screen, I want more information. Does that make sense? So at any given point, whatever screen I'm displaying, one of the things I want to do is minimize how many times how many trips that I have to make to the database. The fewer the better. That's going to make for a faster application. Going to make it scale much better. And so I want to minimize the number of trips to the database, and I want to minimize the complexity of those operations as well. Does that make sense? Less complex operations, less complex database queries lead to a faster system. Okay? So at minimum, you have one trip to the database. That's basically the lowest you can go, right? Is I go make one query, right? In fact, the easiest thing to do is say, hey, I want to call find one. That's the cheapest thing we can do. Does that make sense? In terms of Mongo, find one is the cheapest, basically the cheapest database operations that we can get to, and if we can get to it, then we're awesome. Cool? So that's part of where I'm trying to get to. All right, so right now, what database operations do I need to populate this script? I need to find, right? And so specifically, I need to find from what collection?
Pets.
Okay. So here I need to do some sort of pets dot find. And specifically, I'm probably going to be finding all of the pets. Okay. What do I need to do for this other screen? Where's the data located?
And how we relate that to
Okay, it does, right? So let's say that these are all 3 separate collections. What operations do I need to do if they're 3 separate collections? Thoughts?
Yeah, like remember, I mean, it's like you need to join them, but like $time lookup or something.
Okay. I could do a lookup. I actually don't need to do a lookup for this. Let's say I take a much simpler approach. Where's all the data that I need? Which collections is the data in? I could do a join, but it's actually more expensive than what I need to do. Where's the data located? So starting at the top, the name, the species, the gender, the age, where's that located?
pets.
It's in pets. Okay. Where are likes and dislikes located?
Yes. Probably pets.
Probably pets, right? Probably pets. It'd be reasonable to say that's in pets. Okay. So I need to know, I know that I at least need to pull some data from pets. How many records do I need to pull from pets?
This one.
Just one. So here I can do a find one, right? Because I need one record, not many records. Okay. So, all right, I can do a find one here. All right, is there any data that I'm missing? Well, let's talk about the bio. Where would the bio be located? Well, look at our options. I've got 2 options, right? One option is to just add it to pets, right? Another option is to add another collection out here called bio. You're shaking your head. Why?
It's only you're only adding one field.
Only adding basically one field. I mean, I might be adding some more logging information. I would be making the pets smaller. The pet documents would get a lot smaller because the bio could be pretty big. Right? So I might be getting smaller documents.
And people might want to, when they're looking up the pet, they probably want to look up the bio as well, because the bio might have pertinent information about the pet.
So the problem is if I break that out, then I also have to do bios.find one. Right? I have to find a record from pets as well as a record from bios. And what was our overarching rule?
Data that's accessed together should be stored together.
Should be stored together. This data is being accessed together. So we store it together. That's why. Because the bio is being accessed together with the pet, we store it together with the pet. Make sense? That's the overarching rule. And so that's what that means, is don't take stuff out like this that you're going to access together. Don't break it out into another collection. Keep it in the same collection. Cool? Okay. So that means I don't need to do a bios find one. Okay. Because we located that into pets. So we said, okay, likes, dislikes, and bio, we're going to just add those as additional fields to pets. Which means that I might be pulling back more data over here. If I do a find, this is now pulling back likes and dislikes and bio. That's a question. Okay. Toys. Toys, we said, is a separate thing, right? So how many toys can the pet have? Well, multiple, right? They might have a ball and a mouse and a bone and a squeaky toy. And so I have to say, let's go to toys and let's do find. Right? So to populate this, I'm going to have to make 2 trips to the database. Does that make sense? And the reason I say I don't need to do a join is because I can just do it this way. I can do a find one and a find and put the data together. Because I can just say, hey, find the pet with this ID, find the toys that belong to this pet. So they're actually pretty cheap operations. In fact, I can run them at the same time. I don't have to wait for one to finish before I can do the other. I can simultaneously run both of these requests. Does that make sense? Because they don't depend on each other. So it's actually cheaper to do these 2 simultaneously than it is to do a join. Which is one of the reasons why we say we want to avoid joins where possible. Okay? Questions? Okay. One next question in here, appointments. Say this pet has some appointments, maybe to go to get groomed, go visit the vet, go out to the dog park or the cat park or whatever. Is that information listed here? It's not listed here, right? So it's not accessed together. Does that make sense? So the toys we are accessing together with the pets to populate the screen. We're not accessing appointments together. Cool? Another thing to think about, yes, pets, some pets have a lot of toys. We have a lot of cat toys floating around our house. What's the upper limit of how many toys your pet actually probably plays with? Probably 3. So I can say that there's probably 1 to 3 toys per pet. How many appointments does your pet have?
Could be several per year.
Several per year, right? So let's just say that we have, let's be generous and we say that there's 4 per year. Okay, 4 per year. So if this pet is 10 years old, there's probably about 40 appointments in there. Okay. Is this toys, is this bounded or unbounded?
So by bounded or unbounded, do they mean that it literally cannot get any bigger, or do they mean that it probably won't get any bigger?
Probably won't get
The way
any
I was
bigger.
interpreting it is everything's an unbounded array, unless you have something in your application that defines you can only have a certain number of things.
I define it as probably.
Okay.
Probably is generally good enough. Probably is generally good enough. So if I define it as probably, is this bounded or unbounded?
Yeah.
Huh? Okay. How is it unbounded?
It's not like just 1 to 3 more.
It could be more, but it probably won't be. Right? It probably won't be. Because there are some upper limits. Like, for instance, you can only have so many toys in your house before, well, you run out of space. So in some sense, you have bound in terms of how many you can fit in your house. You also maybe have a bound in terms of, like, as you start getting more, you might be getting rid of some, right? I might get rid of those. More than likely, actually, what happens is the cat hides them under the furniture. And so they're there, but we don't know about them anymore, right? And it's almost as if they're not there. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going with that, like, so technically appointments, I guess you're limited to 365 days in a year. So that's kind of like that.
Yeah, you could say it's bounded, but still 365 per year, that you're still talking per year, right? And so the problem is also kind of talking about, you know, the theoretical of how it works out, right? So 365 per year, okay, that's maybe a bound, but it's far enough up to consider it unbounded. Does that make sense? It behaves more like there isn't a bound. So I would say that these appointments are effectively unbounded. They don't have a reasonable or a small bound. They're a much larger bound, especially if you go for 365 a year. That's a lot. And so there's a lot of cases where that probably would happen. Versus I would treat this as bounded. Because there's a greater chance that that stays small. Yes, it could grow infinitely, but it probably won't. Right? So there's a trade-off where you have to say, you know, theoretically it could happen, but maybe we're not going to allow it to happen, or we're not going to build for that. Does that make sense? So this is bounded, and because I also have the stipulation over here that this is going to be accessed together, I would like to get down to just pets find one. Right? So I would take these toys and move it into pets. Does that make sense? If I store the toys as part of the pets, then that is just a single find one. Make sense? Okay. So one thing you might ask in these appointments, okay, so appointments don't appear on either of these two screens. What screen does the appointments appear on?
I'm confused. When you go to adopt a pet, they tell you about appointments.
Well, maybe this is an appointment to adopt a pet. Maybe this is you asking for an appointment.
Well, I was just thinking, like, are the appointments, like, would there even be a front end for that, or would that just be something you store in your database?
That's a good question. And the answer is generally to that is everything needs a front. That's been my experience. Anytime I've said to something like, well, that doesn't need a front end, we'll just manage that through Compass or whatever tool. Before, you know, within a year or two of that, they want to manage it somewhere and they want an interface. So it's usually safe to assume that there will eventually need to be an interface, and it will probably be sooner than you expect. Because managing things directly through the database is not usually a reasonable solution. Even with SQL, your users are not that common in SQL.
So would this appointments thing be more of an employee kind of interface where we would have like a button maybe on that second view there that says schedule appointments, but you don't get to see the appointments, so it's more of a request thing?
Yep.
And when you're signed in as an employee for this pet place, you might be able to click on one of those spaces there and see ability to change your edit.
Exactly. And so you also have this distinction between what's employee privy information and what is like just the user privy information, right? So this information is kind of designed for the person who wants to adopt the pet, and the other side is for the employers that are running the adoption agency and trying to get these pets adopted, right? So what does their interface look like?
Probably strictly name, gender, and that sort of stuff, and then the ability to edit appointments.
Or I may just want strictly a screen to view appointments. So I might look at a screen like this. The way I might model this is I would say, let's make a bunch of rows. These are all appointments, and so I could say, Paul Smith at 2:15 wants to see Watson Mickey Mouse, right? At 2:30, wants to see Pluto, right? You kind of get the picture, right? So you have the name of the person that's coming to visit, what time, and what pet they were to visit. And this person doesn't need a lot of information about the pet because they're already working with it, right? They're at the what do we call it?
First name basis?
Yeah, they're at the first name basis. So they know, okay, Watson, Pluto, I know who that is. I know what pet that is. But I don't know the person who's coming to visit. They're strangers. So my view on this side is going to inherently be different than that side. And I have kind of different goals in mind, if that makes sense, right? So the way I slice the data is going to look differently over here, right? So in order to populate this, right, we talked about how to query the database for those two. How do I need to query the database for this? Well, I obviously need to go to appointments, right? And so I want to say appointments .find. That's what I want to be able to do to populate that place. Does that make sense? I just want to go do a find on the appointments, and it will give me the records that are here. Yeah.
I was just going to say, you just want to just find all of them, and then from there you can just filter out if you need to.
I would probably end up doing some criteria here. I would probably end up having some sort of interface up here that would let me do some things.
Oh, and we're in a different server.
That would do things like, hey, I want to know what day. Like I want to know appointments for today, or the appointments for the next week, or appointments at 30 days. I could kind of stick some of that information up there, but it would still end up being a find. Because I'm still finding multiple results from one collection, from one data. Okay. So if I have this, right, I know I need the visitor. I need to know who's coming. I need a time. And I need to know the pet. Okay. So the name of the pet, where did we store that? Where did we store the name of the pet? Well, we stored that up in pets, right? And so one of the things that you have to do, remember our goal is to be able to just do as few database operations as possible. And so if all I keep in appointments is the ID of the pet, then every time I go do this, I'm going to have to go hit the pets collection as well. Which means I also have to do, well, I'm going to go look at the pets. Well, for each of these records, I need to go find information from the pet. What kind of operation can I use to get that, the pet's name? Is that a find one? Is that a find?
Let's find one.
Okay.
Because if you got the ID, you just find one.
So it would be like pets.find1, and I'd find it by ID. Well, the problem is, let's say this pulls back and I want to show 100 pets. How many times do I have to call find one?
You have to do it for the number of collections of appointments.
The number of appointments, right? So if this comes back with 100 results, I've got to run a find one 100 times. Do you see the problem? I don't want to do that. If you ever find yourself doing find or find one in a loop, you might want to reconsider your database schema, right? Because that will not scale now, okay? So, it's not practical. This is one place where we could do a join, right? we could do a join, and that would be more efficient than doing find one in a loop, but I do want to avoid that, right? So what does that mean about what we're doing here? Well, that means that I also need to have internally to this is I need to have the pet name needs to be in this appointments document. And so as long as I put that information, the name of the pet or species or whatever I'm going to show here, if I have all that information, then all I have to do is appointments document. Is that clear? So we want to structure our data in that way that whatever interface we end up building can be very simple queries. Okay? And so sometimes that means you do have to step back and sketch out the user interface to work back to how you're going to deal with the data. Okay? Are we clear? So, the outcome of this is that I would make this toys, I would make a sub-document, and appointments, I would make a separate collection, right? So this would end up with 2 collections, pets and appointments, not pets, appointments, and toys. Okay? Are we clear? Questions? Okay. I'm going to make some space so we can step. So there are some maybe non-obvious consequences to dealing with some of these things, or how I work with the database, given the related nature of the data. So I want to step back and think about how we're going to do some of these different operations. So remember the routes that we've been building are kind of to fill out the necessary Crud operations, right? So our basic Crud operations are list, get a single record, create a new record, update a record, and delete a record. Okay. And the way we do these changes a little bit depending on how we store the data. Okay. Whether you use nested collections or you have separate collections, the way we bring the data together and the way we query the data is going to look different. Is that clear? So we've got 3 different cases we want to cover. So the first case is the one we've already worked with, which is, what if it's just independent? Right? If we're just dealing with an independent collection, not related to anything, that's kind of what we've done already. If we've got a child collection, which would be like the pets, the toys belong to the pets, or the appointments belong to the pets, or you've got, actually, let's call that related. Or, yeah, call it child. No, there are 2 collections. I'll just say 2 collections. Each 2 collections, nested collection, or nested. Okay. So let's say we have this operations, right? So from the database perspective, if I want to do a list, which function do I call? Which method do I call?
Find.
Just find. Okay. So I'm going to call find here, and generally I say I want all the data, so I don't put any criteria. Get. what operation do I, what method do I need to call? Find one. And I do want to pass some data in there, so it might be the like ID. Okay? If I want to create a record, insert one. Okay? So insert one. And that generally takes an object, whatever. So this would be like the document that we want to insert. What about update?
Update.
Okay. Update one, what does it need to take? What information do we need to know what we're updating?
Maybe know the ID of what we're targeting, and then also whatever fields need to change.
Yeah, so like, I need to know what I'm going to update. Okay. What about deleting? So there I would do delete. So we've seen some of this stuff already, right? That's kind of the easy side of things, right? So those are kind of the database methods that we've built already, right? Is they have that sort of signature. Is everybody with me? Okay. So now how does this work if I've got two related collections? Like I've got pets and appointments. If I want to query for all of the appointments that belong to the pet, what kind of operation do I need to do?
So what's the given data? Know what?
So I know what pet it's for,
Okay.
right? I want to go get all the records for the pet, all the appointments. So,
Isn't that just defined?
huh?
Isn't that just defined with an ID equals this?
Sort of. So here's what I would do. Is effectively we need to go to the appointments collection. This is stored in appointments. So here I need to go to appointments. That's where the data is. Remember, I want to get back more than one appointment, so it'd be fine. And what I know is, say, the pet ID over here. Right? I know the parent ID. Okay. I don't know the ID of the appointments themselves, but I know the ID of the parent document. Is that clear? Okay. So this would give me all of the appointments that belong to the pet. If I just do it define with no conditions, that would give me all of the appointments in the database. Right? If I say, hey, I just want the appointments that maybe are children. Okay. You can think of that as like, hey, I want all the comments that go with this bug. Right? So I need to know what bug I'm looking for. All right. Now, if I want a single appointment, what collection do I need to go to?
Appointments.
You go to appointments. Okay. Do I do a find or a find one? Well, I'm looking for one record, right? So I would say here, I would say, hey, let's do a find one. And the information that I have is actually at this point, at the minimum, I could go with just one ID. I could say, maybe I just have the appointment ID. That could be fine. Or more than likely, you may want to set it up in a way that you actually have both. So at this point, maybe I have both the pet ID and the appointment ID. Okay. At that point, I'm probably going to have both of those pieces. I'm going to say I have both of those pieces of information. If I'm drilling down, right? So maybe I have both of those things as part of like the route to how we get them, right? The ID of the pet as well as the ID of the appointment. Okay, cool. Now when I insert a pet or insert appointment, obviously it's going to go into the appointments collection. it still would be an insert one. And I still just really need a document to go in. Okay. It's just that this document now needs to include like the pet ID as well and the pet name. Make sense? The other way I could do this, it doesn't necessarily need to have both IDs. I could go ahead and just do the appointment ID. I can do either with both or just the one. But there's a distinction between this one is one an ID for one thing and then it's an ID for something else down here. Update, same sort of idea. So I go to the appointments. I go update one. I need to know which appointment that I'm updating. So I definitely need to know the appointment ID, and I need to know what we're going to update. And if I want to delete one, the information that's required is just the appointment ID. Does that make sense? Right? It's worth noting for the find, for the update one and the delete one, I can also pass in the pet ID, and I might want that information. I might want to pass the pet ID to all three of these. Probably be a reasonable thing to do. Okay, but it's not strictly required for anything except the list. Okay, may or may not be strictly required for anything but the list, at least in this view. Now, what if I flip over and I say I wanted to do the toys as a nested array inside of the pet object? If I want to do the same thing and list all the toys that belong to a particular pet, what database operation do I need to run? Well, what collection do we start with? What collection do we query? Remember, there's no toys, right? So because there's no toys, the toys are part of the pet. I would start by querying the pets. How many pets do I need to get? Well, just one. So if it's a nested array within that document, I would say pets, find one, and I would just say let's pass in the pet ID. Okay? So if they're separate, I'm querying a separate collection and calling find. If they're nested, I'm querying the pets collection and calling find one. You're seeing some of the differences, right? To do the same thing requires a different approach. Is that okay? All right. Further on, what if I want to get a single toy? It's also worth noting that this actually gives me back a pet, right? It gives me back a pet, so I have to kind of break off just the toys. Yes?
No, I was just going to say, so basically that's just finding, like extracting the array as like a single object, like find one and finding the array.
Well, this would be finding the whole pet. So I need to say like dot toys.
Oh, okay, I get it.
Right? I need to say, hey, give me the toys off of that pet. Okay. Now what if I want to find a single toy?
It's a subdocument, right?
It's a subdocument.
What does it contain? Just an array?
Well, we're saying that the pets contains an array of toys. It's called toys.
And we can always assume that arrays are not sorted, right?
We can, for this, yes, we can assume the array is not sorted.
So if the array just contains a string, is that what it contains? Or is it an
It
array
would
of
contain
dot?
objects, called objects, right?
So then it has IDs,
Would have IDs.
so we could target that one ID.
Right, so we could say, let's target it by IDs, right? So my question is still, what do we do with the database, right? How do I query the database? Well, what, first question is, what collection is it? Well, it's in pets, right? So it's still in pets. If I want a single toy, it's still going to start out as pets.find1. So I need to find that single pet. Okay. From there, what? So that pet has an array of toys, right? So if I say dot toys, we now have an array of toys, but I just want a single toy with a particular ID. What do I do? So I've got an array of, that got me down to, we already saw I can get down to an array of the toys for that pet, but I want a toy with a particular ID. It's worth kind of noting at this point. So pets.find1 is kind of running against the database. When we access for the toys, that's actually not running on the database side, that's running on our code. And so at this point, this is an array we have in memory. It's actually a JavaScript array. How do you search a JavaScript array?
Square brackets.
You could do square brackets. Doesn't work here. Square brackets gives you like 0, 1, 2, 3, but I'm looking for one with, I'm looking for something. Find, right? So remember when we first built this out, when we built the system out, before we put the database in place, remember we were storing our issues and our bugs in an array, right? And so you got introduced to that find method. Remember that? So from here, I can call find on the array find on the array. Remember that it takes a lambda, right? And so my conditions would be x underscore ID is equal to the toy ID. That would get me down to the document that I'm interested in. Is everybody clear with that? That would get me down to the particular toy that I'm querying for. Okay. Those are the easy ones. I was kind of playing around with this morning to make sure that I had all my cards right and trying to get to what code would be necessary to make the other things happen. Because there may be require a little bit more thinking. Okay. And I might need some more space to put them in there. So we know what happens, right, if it's separate collections, right? But we have to do a little bit of thinking if we want to add something that is a nested or manipulate data that is nested, okay? So, we kind of have to do this thing where with getting the data, we asked for the pet, and then we started doing the rest of it with JavaScript, right? Well, when I'm doing an insert, an update, or delete, I don't really have that option, generally speaking. Where I do some of the stuff, I don't really may not have that option where I do some of the stuff in JavaScript and some of it in the database. Okay? So it means you have to think about it a little bit deeper. So let's say that I want to add a toy. Remember, what collection are we dealing with? Toys are located in the pets collection. Okay. So when I want to add a toy, is it an insert into pets? No. Because if I was inserting into pets, I'm adding a new pet. Right? So it can't be an insert. If I'm working with nested data and trying to manipulate nested data, it is not an insert. It's an update. Okay, so we're going to do an update one because we're updating one pet. Okay. Remember, the update one takes 2 arguments. So we have to say, well, what are we updating, right? So we're definitely updating based on the ID of the pet, which would be here, it would be like underscore ID is equal to pet ID. Okay, so I can start with that. Remember that I also need an update document, okay? So what operation do I need to perform?
Catch that
So I'm trying to remember, let's step back. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to add a toy to the pet, right? I want to add a toy to the pet. Do you remember the different update operators that we used? The most common one you used was set, okay? But there are some other operators that you can use, right? So remember, set will set it to a particular value, right? But the problem is I don't want to replace all of the toys that are there. I want to add a new one to the array. Does that make sense? So if I set toys, I will be replacing the entire toys array with what I give it, right? Throwing away all the toys that were there previously. I just want to add a new one, okay? And so because I just want to add a new one, you can use the push operator. The push operator adds a new thing to the end of an array. Everybody with me there? Push adds it to the end of an array. So if I want to push a new toy, I'm going to say, let's push it to the toys array, and I'm going to add my toy. Okay. Everybody with me there? So that's how I would add a nested document. Is I would do an update with the push operator. Now, I need to make some more space because I'm now out of outer space. Huh?
You're out of the middle.
Yeah. So I was hoping I could fit all this in, but it's definitely not going to happen in my limited screen here today. So we dealt with, this would be, so if we want to do list, that's here. We want to do get, that's here. If we want to insert, that's actually an update. Now, what about actually updating? If I want to update a toy that's already in there, how do I update the toy that's already there?
Just use the set operator.
Okay. So if I say, let's do the set operator, that's a reasonable suggestion. So it still would be an update, update one underscore ID would be the pet ID. And we said we wanted to do the set operator. Okay, but what were we going to set?
So if you know the other toys, then you can do this, but if you don't
So,
know the other toys, then I'm gonna write them all.
just to throw something that's out here, what happens if I take that approach?
Gonna replace all your toys with that one toy.
With that one toy. And in fact, at this point, the toys is no longer an array. It's just a single object. Right? So that's a problem. I lose all my toys. I could try to fix it and say, hey, let's just put brackets around there. And now toys is an array, but I've still lost all of the toys that were there previously. Does that make sense? Because I still replace toys with this new array. So there's a problem. Thoughts?
Inside the sets, we could now put in an optional filter and filter it only to the toy ID.
Okay.
Applying that set to one part of the array.
How does that help me? I mean, you're not wrong. That is part of the solution. But how does that help me? So let's think about this. If I want to update the third toy in the array, that would be toys.2, right? Track one, right? If I want to update the third toy in the array, that would be toys2. Clear? If I want to update the name of that toy, that would be toys2 name. Is everybody tracking with me here? So I could say that that is new name. Okay. So if I did this, this would always update the name of the third toy. Okay? Is everybody tracking with me there? It would always update the name of the third toy. So the problem is that this right here is unknown. I don't know where the toy is in the array. Is everybody tracking with me there? I don't know where the toy is in the array. Okay? If I did know, this would work. Clear? If I did know, this would work. Okay. So there is an interesting sort of thing. I'll bring this up and give you a link to it. So I'll toss a link to this on Discord. So there's a special usage of the $sign. They call it the positional operator. So the top of this says the positional operator defines an element in an array to update without explicitly specifying the position of the element in the array. This is kind of the missing piece, right? This is the missing piece to make this work. So if we say here, positional operator has this form. You take an array, dot, $sign. You can also do array dot $sign dot or dot type or dot color. Okay? You can add additional fields on that. And that says, okay, I want to, I can say, hey, I want to deal with that field. Now, the next question is how does this $sign even know what element to be? So the way that this works out, and I think there's an example down here. Okay, it says when you use it with you can use it with update. Okay, and when we use it with update, the positional $sign operator acts as a placeholder for the first element in the array that matches the query document. Okay, remember when I call update, there's the query document and the update document. Query document and update document. Okay, so the magical sauce in here is I go back up to the top and I say we have another condition for finding the pet I want to update, and it is this: toys dot ID, should be underscore ID, toys underscore ID, because that's the name of the thing we're looking for, and I would say that is the toy ID. That's my new query document. And so by adding this, I'm saying find the document where the pet ID, the underscore ID is this, the primary key is pet ID. And within the toys array, there is a document, there's an object with the property of underscore ID set to this way. So both of these things have to be true or we don't get a pet at all. Are you tracking with me here? What this does though, is it defines that $sign operator to refer to what index the toy is in. So there I can now change this to be like so. Toys $name. And if I want to update, say, the color of the toy, I can do that as well. So I can say toys.$color new color. So that gives me a way of updating the fields. Is everybody with me there? I will note that there are some things I tried that didn't work. So for instance, if I try to do toys $, and try to set that to update, it actually completely replaced the toy with this document here. This did a full replace. So it didn't allow me to just say, hey, I really want to update some of the fields. This does a replace. So I don't think you generally want to do that unless you're actually intending to replace all of the fields. You know, that's one kind of stipulation. Another thing that I found is if I did toys $.color and this was set to undefined, one would hope that that either doesn't make a difference or whatnot, but my experience with doing this is it ended up setting the color to null. Okay. Everybody tracking with me there? So if you are going to set this, you do have to ensure, I would recommend using this syntax over trying to replace the whole thing. And I would not I would say that you really have to kind of be careful that you're not having undefined on the other side. Cool. So those are definitely two batches that I found with working with it. that make sense for everybody? You can kind of see there's a little bit more going on if you want to update a nested document, just so we're there, right? So it looks different. Okay. Now, last one's up. If I want to delete a document, this is one I had a little bit of trouble with. Because if you look this up on Stack Overflow, or if you look this up on online, there's actually a lot of information that just kind of didn't work for me, to be honest. Okay. So with the delete, I think the main thing that I saw is a lot of people suggested using unset, and unset actually left me with a null in the array. Okay, so I won't actually use unset, I'll use a different operand. So when I want to do the delete, what are my conditions? Well, I know if I want to remove a toy, I know I need to have the pet ID. It actually turns out that in order to do the delete, I also need to find where the toy is in the array as well, because I need this $ thing as well. So I'm also going to do the same trick over here. So we say, hey, let's do toys underscore ID is equal to the toy ID. So I put 2 criteria in there. Let's find the pet and make sure that there is a toy with that ID in the array of toys. Cool. Okay. Then we come down here, and the operator I had to use, the operator that after a little bit of testing actually turned out to be, and some research, turned out to be the pull operator. So what the pull operator does is it removes an element from the array. So push adds something to the array, pull removes it. It was kind of surprising to me because I'm used to pull always removing things from the end. And actually, I think I was thinking about pop, actually. So pull allows you to remove a specific element from the array. Let me look at my code just to make sure that I'm doing this right. So, yeah. So from here, I want to say, well, the field I want to update, the field I'm working with is toys. And then what goes to the right of the colon is you say, okay, within this array of toys, what are my conditions for what you want to remove? Okay? So specifically, I'm looking for a toy. Actually, I don't think, come to think of it, I actually don't need this part. I thought I did at one point. Actually, I'm going to leave it there. It doesn't hurt anything. Then over on here, I had to say underscore ID is the toy ID. So basically this says remove all the toys from the toys array where the ID is toy ID. If I want to say, hey, let's remove all the balls, I could say type ball. Kind of thing. So that's to at least get you some pointers towards some of the things you need to know about, right? So you need to use, if you're going to do this as nested data, you're going to need the push operator, you're going to need the set operator, you're going to need the pull operator. Okay. Questions? Is this starting to make sense, kind of giving people a picture of what you want to do in your code? Anybody still writing? Back to clean slate. those are some parts that you'll need to know about. So, a few things to think about, and let's just, thinking about some of the routes. So for instance, if I want to update, I'll say one in specific, because it's going to have a few things. So let's say I have a route that looks like this, put API /pet API pet 1, 2, 3. Actually, you can do that as colon pet ID and appointment. Okay. So if I have a route like this, what would you expect this route to do, or what we've done before? What are the basic CRUD operations is this doing?
Updating appointment.
Update an appointment, right? So, because we've used put for create, and we've used it for update, right? So I know it's either create or update. At the end of this, I know the ID of the appointment, so it's definitely an update. I'm updating an appointment that already exists. Otherwise, it would end in new. Okay? So when I've got this, the goal of this is to update an appointment. So talking about the middleware that we talked about on Tuesday, what middlewares would I need to install for this route? What are the inputs to this route?
Their IDs.
Huh?
Their IDs.
Yep, so I've got a pet ID coming in, also have an appointment ID coming in, and I also have the body of the request, because the body of the request is also going to tell me how do I update that appointment. Okay, so what I would expect with a route like this is that you should be installing valid ID, for pet ID, valid ID for the appointment ID, and you're also going to have valid body with some sort of schema. Right. That's the one that's going to have the most constraints. Right. Your update route's going to have the most constraints. Because, for instance, if I create a record, well, then I only need to know the pet ID and the body. If I'm getting a record, then I just need potentially one of those two, both of those two, right? So things to think about. Cool. So sometimes you may find yourself having more than one of these in here when you have multiples on their own. And that's part of why we broke that out to a middleware, is because it makes things like this really easy, rather than having to duplicate, go get the pet ID, go get the appointment ID, in all of these different routes. Cool. So that's one of the reasons we went through the work of making this into middleware. So that's one thing to just keep in mind. You may need to have more than one of these validators in there. Okay. All right. Let's see. So stepping away maybe from our fictional example of pets for a moment, and talking about pet adoption. What is the actual problem that we're trying to solve with the issue problem? What is the actual problem we're trying to solve with the issue? What collections do we have? Question for everybody. What collections do we have? Huh? Bugs and users. I have users. I have bugs. Okay. And you'll remember when we initially designed this database, we had a bunch of other things maybe attached to that. And so we're starting with our API with just those two central pieces, with the plan to add things as we go. 4.3, who's looked at 4.3 already and started coding? I've seen a few people. Okay. So what two new entities are being added in 4-3 in Lab 4.3?
Comments and test cases.
Comments and test cases. Okay. So comments are connected to bugs or they're connected to users?
Both.
Both. Okay. So comments sit somewhere here in the middle. Okay. Because you make a comment on a bug, and that comment is made by a user. Okay. What about test cases? Where do they sit?
Both as well, but a little more to the bug side.
Okay. There's kind of a little bit more on the bug side. So they're connected to a bug and they're connected to a user. Right. As far as multiplicities go, what's the relationship with these? How many bugs is a comment related to? Related to 1, right? So 1 up here, and how many comments can a bug have? Multiple, right? So our relationship looks like that, right? And our relationship, it turns out, on the user side looks the same way. Okay. What about users and test cases?
1 too many users.
So 1 to many. Somebody else. What about bugs and test cases? Okay. Bugs and test cases. What's our relationship here? Okay. Anything? Okay. So one of the things that we were concerned about, right, is what is a bounded versus unbounded, right? So I might want to put some more constraints here, right? So for the bugs, right, how many comments can a bug have? Let's start with the minimum. What's the minimum number of comments a bug can have? 0. It's entirely possible, entirely likely when a bug gets created, it's going to start out with 0 comments, right? So you're going to be 0 to what? Is there an upper limit to how many comments you can add to a bug? Not realistically. I mean, it's probably going to be at most a few hundred.
Really?
At most a few hundred. Yeah, I mean, if there's a bug out there on a popular, like open source, maybe an NPM package there, and there's a lot of issues with it, there might be 200 comments on that bug. There might be 200 comments on that bug. Think about a forum thread. What's the longest forum thread you've seen? Well, a bug can be that long. When a lot of people have an opinion on it, it's a forum thread. So that can be a lot, okay? That definitely means there's an unbounded relationship here. How many comments can a user make? Well, what's the lower limit? If you register a new account How many comments have you made? None. So it's entirely possible for you to have made no comments. Is there an upper limit to how many comments you can make? This is where we come back to X number per year, right? Where we said, hey, you said it's up to 365 appointments per year. Well, I could probably make 365 comments per year. It wouldn't be too hard, right? In fact, that would be very easy to make multiple comments a day. So I would say this doesn't have a bound. Does that make sense? So like when we're dealing with the comments, neither of those sides really has a bound, right? They always belong to one user and one bug, but you know, in terms of the many side here, that can be a lot. Okay, bugs. Bugs to test cases. What's the minimum number of test cases that a bug can have?
Well, when you make it, it doesn't have to have any.
When you make it, it doesn't have to have any. So it could start out as 0. Okay, so it technically could start out as 0. Although usually, right, if I'm going to fix a bug and try to make this official and push it out, I probably want there to be at least one test case before I call it done. So this is where I lean on probabilistic more than what it's actually going to be about. Like it actually can be 0, but more than likely I want it to be 1 or more. So sometimes it's better to think about what it will be most of the time. What's the upper limit of test cases? What's the average number of test cases you might expect for a bug? I'll tell you from experience, it's usually single digits, right? So it's usually single digits that come out of here. So I might say the average is maybe somewhere in 1 to 5. 1 to 5 test cases is pretty much the norm for that. Okay. That tells us something, right? If we're talking about the relationship between bugs and comments, that's unbounded, right? Okay. So this relationship here is an unbounded relationship, which would mean that it's bad to keep the comments in the bug, right? That is something that we should not be storing as an array inside of the bug because of that. Like comments can't be stored as part of the bug. They need to be stored as a separate collection. This one, well, on the other side, this one is bounded. So we have options. Does that make sense? So just like the toys and appointments, maybe some of these end up being bounded and some of these don't end up being bounded. Okay. And so here we really, really need to break those up if we're going to be able to scale. I mean, you're probably not going to hit that limit on a tiny little system that you're building, right? But if you were to roll this into production, you need to treat that as unbounded because eventually otherwise your system's going to break when somebody adds one too many comments, right? And so to prepare for that, we're going to program ahead, okay? So with test cases, on the other hand, I could either keep those as 2 separate collections, or I could embed the test cases within the bugs. Does that make sense? I can do one or the other. I can either keep the test cases separate, or I can make them part of the bug. Okay. So how did we determine which one we should do with the pets and those collections with that data? What did we start doing? What did I do to kind of sketch it out?
Find out front end?
Yeah, plan out the front end, right? So I kind of started planning out what the front end's going to look like and where things will fit to kind of know where things are going to go. Cool. So that's a thing that I would stress you to start to think about right now. Like that's the thing that I would stress to think about at this stage of the process is it's a good time to start sketching out what you think the front end might look like. Because that may start helping you make decisions at this point. Cool? Okay. So that's one thing I need to think about. Remember, the rule was data that is accessed together should be stored together. Okay? So just because it's bounded doesn't mean that it's going to be accessed together. Right? Just because this array is small doesn't mean the data is going to be accessed together. It just means that it's safe for me to potentially use it as a subdocument. It doesn't mean that it's still, it doesn't yet mean that it's advisable. Is everybody with me there? It doesn't mean yet that it's advisable. Okay. So, what are some screens that we need? What are some screens that we need? Just listing off the screens.
Can you see all the bugs?
So you're saying, see all the bugs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what were you saying?
I was thinking like a comment form, like a form to fill out a comment.
A comment to fill out a comment. That's probably not going to be a page all of itself. Yes, I need to have that somewhere on the UI, but it's probably not going to be a page or a screen by itself.
So it's expected like a login page?
Okay, that's reasonable. So there might be some sort of login, just listing off screens. Screens. So you said there was a login, and Evan, you said like a bug list.
Mm-hmm.
What else? What other screens is this might this application need?
We're going to want to see a specific bug.
Okay.
Details about it.
So I might call that like a bug details screen. Okay, what else? What else do we need to capture and kind of work with the functionality that we have? Think about the routes that you've already built, right? So going through the user's API, are there any routes that are kind of not accounted for? Yeah, so I need a registration screen. Okay. So I have a login screen, I've got a register screen. What else?
Profile page for a user.
Okay. So I need a profile page. Which route would that be linked to? So that would be like get API user ID, right? That's where that route's going to be used, is for that profile screen. What else?
Does that register only account for the user, or are we also throwing in bug there as well?
What do you mean?
You just wrote register, so are someone already account for the bug creation?
So I would put bug creation in a different place. So I'd say let's report a bug. You register user and report a bug. Okay. Anything else? There'd be routes that you haven't used. So we have a bug list. Do we need a user list? Maybe somewhere. Is it possible that somebody as an administrator might need to be able to go look at all of the users that are on the system? Okay, so just like we have a bug list, we would have a user list, which would link to the profile page. Okay. Is that everything? So one of the questions was, how about commenting on a bug? Can I comment on a bug on one of these screens? Okay, so what screen would you put that on?
Bug details.
Bug details. Okay, so this would include our comments. So everything related to comments, viewing them, entering them, all of that would be under bug details. So that also includes the comments. Okay. So thinking through our API, we've got a user list. Okay. We've got a get a user, which is that one. We've got a login and a register. Remember that we can also update a user, right? So where do I go to update a user? Okay. So we'll put that in here. We'll say that that functionality fits in here. What about deleting a user? Where do I go do that?
Or not going to give them the choice to delete themselves.
You sure?
I'm sure.
How are you sure?
I'm absolutely positive we're not going to.
Okay.
Because they're an employee that is HR's job.
Let's just say if they can delete themselves, it would probably be here, right? If they could delete themselves, it would probably be on their profile or some way accessible through their profile, right? What if it's HR's job to do delete? Where does that delete button occur? It doesn't occur on this screen probably if it's HR that wants to do it. Where are they going to want to do it?
They'll have their own screen. Could be user list.
Yeah. So they're probably want to get and delete the user. If you fire somebody, I don't want to have to necessarily go down here to do it. I'm going to go right here. So oftentimes you may have some buttons here to do kind of quick updates or a quick delete. Okay. Thinking about bugs. So we can report a bug. We can look at the bug list. We can look at the details. Where do I go to update a bug?
I'm thinking we could do it on bug details, and it's
Okay.
just a little button that toggles the switch.
Okay. So which would probably kind of be what you would want to do at the profile page.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What else can we do with bugs? We can classify them. Where do I go to classify a bug? What screen? Thoughts?
Since that has its own route, it should be its own page, right?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Just because it has a different route, that just means it's an action. It's a thing you could do. It doesn't necessarily say that it needs a separate screen. So just like comments, we're going to just say all of the comments routes are going to be part of bug details. They're not going to be separate screens. So classification doesn't necessarily have to have a separate screen, right? But where would be the most sensible place to go? Remember, so the job is the BA looking through the bug list, and they're looking and seeing, okay, this is a bug we want to fix, this is a bug we don't want to fix, or this is a duplicate. We've already had this entered a few times, so I'm going to mark some of these duplicate and close them. Where do you think the BA wants to do that work? Where's going to be the convenient place for where's the BA going to be?
Bug list.
Probably on the bug list, right? Or maybe the profile, right? Maybe bug details. So we would probably have actually both classify here, and we would have classify here. And so remember the very next thing that the VA wants to do generally say, hey, we've decided that yes, we're going to work on it. It's approved. So I'm immediately going to assign it to a developer. So same kind of thing. Wherever I classified it, I probably also want to assign it. If I decided it was duplicate, I would classify as duplicate and close it. So close would probably also want to be here and here. Does that make sense? So we can kind of take the different functionality that we know that we need to do and kind of figure out which screen it needs to go onto. Cool? Okay. So that can help just kind of mentally thinking about and organizing what we're working with. Cool? And where we're going with. Definitely take a note of that stuff because you're going to use it to design your own UI. Okay? I'm telling you, like, this is where the screens need to be arranged, but you're going to actually design the nitty-gritty of where those buttons and what color they are and what font sizes they are and all those kind of things. Cool? So take note of that information. Okay. So we've decided on comments. We haven't said anything about test cases. Where do test cases go? Where do they fit in? So remember, this is now we're looking from the quality analyst perspective. Where should the quality analyst go to work with test cases?
I'm actually under bug list and bug details.
Okay. You're saying bug list and bug details. So in your head, what are you thinking for bug list?
So when you just want the title of the bug, not necessarily the details. You want to be able to quickly make that a decision to go into the test cases that will put into it.
Okay. So what I'm asking is any of the test case information shown on the bug list? So the bug list shows you, here's the list of bugs that are open, that you're working on. Would I want to see the test cases mixed in with that information? I would say probably not.
That might actually be a bit information overload.
Right. At that point, it probably would be information overload. At this point, I might want to know how many test cases there are, right? So here I might want to know the number of test cases, but I don't want to do anything more than that. I just want to know, hey, there's 5 test cases. That's enough information for me, right? Or there's 1 test case, there's no test cases, because maybe I'm looking for bugs that don't have any test cases yet, right? Or I might be looking for the number of test cases that have passed, right? I might want to know how many have passed. I might want to know how many have failed, right? So those numbers would be good to see here, but not the test case themselves. Cool? I might want to see some counts, but I might not want to see the test case itself. So you said bug details, right? At that point, I'm drilling down and seeing what information? The title of the bug, the description of the bug, and the steps to reproduce the bug. Well, the steps to reproduce are kind of probably related to the way I test it, right? If I do X, Y, and Z and the bug occurs, I'm probably going to write my test case based on those steps. Make sense? Because my test case, I'm trying to make the bug happen again and see if it's fixed. So I would lump test cases down at this tier in the bug details. If it looks like there's a lot of functionality in the bug details, that's yes, and that's intentional, because that's the meat and bones of the application. The meat and bones of the application is in the bug details screen and the bug list screen. That's where where our users are going to spend most of their time, is on these 2 screens. So we need to put most of our development effort into them. Okay? So I need to put test cases in there. Okay. So, back to my question before. Bugs and test cases are related. Are they accessed together?
because no matter what, if you show a bug, you show test cases, list
Yeah.
engagements.
So these two ones, here I want to see the count, and here I want to see the test cases on all. They're definitely accessed together. They'd be stored together. That makes sense? So I would expect this to be stored as a subdocument. Store it in an array, and store this as a separate collection. Because on the one hand, the comments are also accessed together. You can make the same argument. The comments are accessed together with the bug. The problem is they're unbounded. Cool? Questions?
I have to change my database schema for sure.
Yeah, you'll have to move a few things around potentially. So that's what I'm looking for. And that's what I would want to do. Okay. Does that help point people in the right directions for 4.3? We just pull 4.3 up just to make sure that everybody's kind of seen it. So those are kind of some of the things to think about as we're dealing with subdocuments and related documents. So 4.3. So the goal with this 4.3 is, as I said, you're going to be adding comments and test cases, and so they're related to bugs. And so what I'm asking for you to build is kind of take the stuff that we've learned, the stuff that we've done with bugs and users, and kind of follow those patterns that we've done, and build an API for comments. And you're going to build an API for test cases as well. Okay, so you got two APIs to build, one for test cases and one for comments. Okay, so a lot of this stuff should be repeats because we've kind of already built two APIs, but some of this stuff is going to be new because of that related data. Okay, and so the idea with comments, you're having only 3 endpoints, a list of comments, giving a specific comment, and create a new comment. So things that aren't in there is there's no route for updating comments and there's no route for deleting comments. The reason for that is we kind of consider this part of our audit track. And so if you were able to change or delete a comment, we would be losing information about kind of what's happening with that bug. So just as a safety precaution, we're not allowing those two things. Cool? That things often comes up. That's also just to remove some of the additional data. So things to make sure that you're doing. Remember to use async await for getting data from the database. Remember to use try and catch to handle any of the errors that might occur with the promise rejections, working with the database, etc. You still want to use joy to validate all of the request data. So you're going to be using that valid body middleware that we wrote. I want you to send everything back as JSON. Whether it's successful or failed, send back a JSON response. Okay. And then we've talked about some of the error codes, 200, 400, 404, 500. Hopefully by now you kind of understand when and where to send those, right? So number 200 represents a successful response. 400 says the data that you sent me is incorrect. It's on the application, it's on the client side. You know, let's say you set up the data incorrectly in Postman, so it's on Postman side. 404 would say this page doesn't exist. So for instance, if I'm trying to access a bug that doesn't exist, well, that would be a 404. If I'm trying to access a comment that doesn't exist or a test case that doesn't exist, that would be a 404. And then 500 is reserved for internal exceptions. And basically, the 500 is something went wrong and I don't know how to fix it. Okay. Yeah, and so then for test cases, there's a few different routes that I want you to implement. One to list all the test cases for a bug. One to get a specific test case. One to create a new test case. You've got one to update a test case. You've got one to execute a test case. So that would be you write the test case and then you execute it. So that's where you mark it passed or failed. It's in the execute route. Kind of like, we have the closed route where you close or open a bug. So execute's the same way. You pass or fail. And then delete a test case. So that's the API for that. And you'll notice that these I've said, okay, all of these endpoints presume that you have a bug ID and the test case ID, or you always know the bug ID because the place where we're putting this is in the context that we already know the bug ID. Okay, so we're going to be using this API on the bug detail screen where we already know what the bug ID is. Does that make sense? Same way with comments. When we ask for the comments, we'll already be on the bug detail screen, so we'll already know the ID of the bug. Make sense? Cool? Questions?
I guess just with the routes,
Yeah.
it's just kind of confusing. Are we building separate modules for each one of these, or are we putting them in one module?
Routes, API comments. It says where to put it. So this needs to be in the, make a new module, call it routes API comments. Routes API test. So I said for both of those where to put it. It's down at the bottom.
How does that work then? Because so that's just the name, right?
Like that's where the file should be located. Yes, that's where the file should be located.
And the literal routes structure themselves can totally be something other than API test. So they're saying API bug instead.
Right, they're API bug. Does people have this written down so I can erase it? Let me take a picture for my own records so I can add it to a later assignment. So remember we've got two files involved in kind of setting this up. We've got code in server.js and we've also got code in the module itself. Okay. So in server.js, I'm going to have something that looks like app.use, use to install a middleware. We're going to have some sort of path here. And so this is in server.js. And we're going to say require /routes API comment. Right? So we have two things happening. We have here's the module we're mounting, and we're mounting it at a mount point, right? So the mount point is kind of the prefix for where you're putting it, okay? There's more than one valid answer to mount to how to put the mount point. I did find something when you were kind of playing around yesterday that there are some things that don't work, so it's not fully as configurable as I thought, but there is more than one right answer, just so we're clear. And I haven't said in this assignment which one is the right way, so they're all right. There's more than one way to do this. So over in comment.js, which is where we're going to put the routes for the comments, we're going to have code that looks like this. Router, take the first route, router.get some route and your request handler. Right? So the question is, what do you put here and what do you put there, right? And so what you put in either of these places are dependent, just so we're clear. What you put in here and you put in here, they change, right? If you make one decision here, it changes the decision here. If you make a decision here, it changes the decision over there. Okay? We're kind of clear with that. Okay. So let's talk about the easiest solution. Mounted at slash. That is the easiest solution. So you just mount it at the root. Okay? If I'm mounted at the root in server.js, what's the root down here? What's the path down here in comment.js for the list route?
You have to write out the whole thing.
We have to write out the whole thing. So if I do slash here, then I have to do slash API that's going to be up in here. Slash API slash bug dot bug ID slash comment Okay, you can do that. I will not take any points off if you do that. That's perfectly fine with me. Okay, that is the easiest way to do it. Okay, are we clear about that? So that's the easy way. You say mount it at the root and specify the whole path down here. Okay. The only benefit, there's two benefits of not doing that. Is A, maybe write a little bit less code over here, and you also, because if we do something different, then we can write a little bit less to this path every time because there's things that are the same every time. And we also potentially make it easier for us to mount it in two different places. Because one of the things I could also do is I could mount this at bug ID, comment list. I might want to mount it without the API before it, or I might want to mount it with the API. Oftentimes what I do there is if it doesn't start with API, then this route would point to an actual HTML file, or with this it returns a JSON file. Does that make sense? So usually the one thing the only thing I need to do to support that is I usually don't want to include the word API down here. Does that make sense? So at minimum, that means I take API, and this is slash API, and I move that up there. I'm also fine with that. There's really no problem if you go that route. You're kind of seeing the trade-off. Okay, you can just pick your split point, and you can do that. If you want to then pull a little bit more off, well, all of those start with API bug, so I could move bug up here and have that down there. That option is also good. So you got three options right there. I don't care which. Honestly, I don't care which one of those three you take. Okay. So, and I don't really have a preference either to which one is correct. I don't think there's a right answer. I don't think there's really a right answer to where you break that out. I say that it's handy to not have the API in there, so I think I would probably at least move that one word up, but it doesn't have to. Another question, you could actually go further and say, well, they all start with bug ID comment, and I think previously I was thinking that you could do that. This part you actually can't move up. The reason being is if you take this up here, then the param bug ID request.params.bug ID evaluates to undefined if you move this part up there. So this at a minimum does need to be in the comment file. Does that make sense? So you've got three options. You can either use slash, you can use slash API, or you can use slash API bug up here. Cool. Does that answer your question? You got three options. I don't care which one you take. So I haven't put any points on.
Just on the top one under services, so the first part is where you're mounting it, and the second part is like what.
Yeah, so this is where we're mounting it. So this is like a prefix that gets added on to what's here.
Okay.
So we're always going to take what's here and add it or concatenate these two pieces together. So as long as this piece and that piece concatenate to the whole thing, okay, that's all I want. I just want those two parts to concatenate together to this. Cool. Did you have a question? I think you had a question at some point. Did that answer the thing we were talking about?
Yeah, so if you're allowing us to use API bug for app.use, how come we don't just put these routes in bug.js?
Because bug.js is already pretty large. That's all. Bug.js is already pretty large.
So if we choose to use API bug for the app.use route, and then we require, the other file name.
Yeah.
Now it just associates two file names with the same starting.
Which is not a problem.
Which is not a problem.
Which is not a problem.
The route from those two.
So what it does is Express goes from the beginning to the end, and it looks for, okay, is there a middleware that matches this path? Is there a middleware that matches this path? Is there a middleware that matches that path? So it runs through, okay, here's a middleware that matches that path. It runs that middleware, and if that middleware doesn't call next, you're done. If that middleware calls next, it runs the next thing, right? And so what happens is you're asking the question of, if I have these two here, and this one's API bug, and we require, so one of these requires bug.js, app.use, API bug, require the comment.js, and if I have both of those in there, how does it know what to use? Well, it concatenates again those two parts together, and it says, okay, the path that the user requested doesn't meet the pattern, right? So it'll actually go through bug.js and try each of those routes, and it'll find that none of those routes match API bug ID comment list. Does that make sense? None of the routes you find in bug.js match that pattern. So continue on and look in comments and say, oh, we found it, right? If you switch them and have them in the other order, it will look at comment.js first, go through there. I'll say, okay, yep, we've got one that matches comment. if we put bug and bug, and then if anything that doesn't match this, it'll then go down to bug. Does that make sense? So it goes through all the middlewares, it goes all through all the routers first, from basically top to bottom. Cool. So as long as that route is the first one that it finds that matches, it's okay. Make sense? So it matters what order they're in, but we can freely break these up. Okay? Cool. Questions? So I would recommend doing bugs and then comments in that order, rather than comments instead of bugs and then bugs. But that, it already takes care of that, because those routes none of these routes will match what we have in bug.js. Cool? None of those routes can match the other patterns. If they match the other patterns, then we have some issues. But these are specifically chosen not to match. Okay? Questions? Concerns? I'll let you guys get to it. Feel free to take your own breaks today as well. Next one. That's what the subject is.